Good afternoon, good evening, good now. I'm not sure where in the world you are today, but welcome to, I suppose, I've spoken at one of these sort of conferences before in Zagreb years back. But welcome to the Galactic Collaboration Summit. This is an online event and it's run by Addis and his friends. Today I'm going to be talking about the top 5 information security tips I believe that you should implement for Microsoft Teams. My name is Alistar Pugin. I have COVID hair. I don't think anyone has seen my hair this long since before I actually started working. I don't think I've had hair like this since before 2001. I think probably all the way back to 1992 or even 91. Anyhow, I'm digressing. My name is Alistar Pugin. I'm an Office Apps and Services MVP as well as an Azure MVP, and my core focus is around security in Azure as well as the M365 stack when it comes to security. Today, I want to talk a bit about security for Teams. I think it's important that we understand what's available when we look at the daily active users for Microsoft Teams. And we've seen Microsoft talk about it increasing from 42 to I think it's just under 90 million daily active users today. And you look at what Satya Nadella said at Build, that their digital transformation, 2 years of digital transformation has actually occurred in 2 months, the first 2 months of COVID. And it's ridiculous at what pace we are actually traveling as humans into moving to the cloud. We see customers all the time coming through the door, especially now saying, hey, can you please help us move to the cloud? It's imperative that we get there because we've got people working from home and we need all our applications available to anyone, anywhere in the world. So it's no longer just about people that are working from home or working from anywhere in the world. People are now working, and we can do that COVID bingo, the new normal, where people are working from home for an indeterminate amount of time, even if they do start bringing down the restrictions. And it's important to talk about security and compliance for Microsoft Teams. Now, when we go through what I wanted to cover today, I should actually just open up these slides and have a look at that. And I want to talk a bit about identity and access management. So how do you manage people accessing your environment? What information protection means, because there's a much larger conversation around that. Also, I want to talk a little bit about data governance and how you manage risk when it comes to what actually happens inside of Teams. Because it's great that we say, well, when we move to our Office 365 tenant, naturally, Teams is available. It's switched on. When you say, give me an Office 365 tenant, it's on by default. So how do we manage all of the risks that is associated with that? So in today's agenda, I want to talk about 5 things that I like, that I believe is where you should start at. Right at the end, there's quite a few other security considerations and what's available to Teams. But my top 5 would be multi-factor authentication and why that's important. What conditional access looks like when you start working with a product like Teams, and how this sort of all-rounder that we call Microsoft 365 brings all the technologies together so that you can utilize things like conditional access inside of Teams. What does it actually mean when you start looking at external access, and how to understand the difference between what external access is and what do you get with external access, and also what guest access means, especially when you start sharing inside of your organization and outside of your organization. The couple of things around Teams policies, what policies are available and what you can do with each policy. And then lastly, I'd like to talk about content protection. So how do you secure content in your environment when you are creating confidential documents, and also when you are sharing these documents externally with people that you have invited into your teams. You know, we've seen over the last 2-3 months where Microsoft has taken a stab at Zoom, and we've seen Zoom meetings being hacked and all of those things. So security is very high up on the food chain when it comes to what we're doing online. We've seen phishing attacks increase and all of those things happen over the last 2-3 months because people are working at home and they're more susceptible to to security risks because you're not sitting behind a perimeter network anymore. You are actually now, your perimeter network is the device that you're connecting to your internet connectivity at home. And it's important to understand what implication that has in the world right now when it comes to what you're allowed. So let's have a look at multi-factor authentication. And I think it's important that we distinguish between authentication and authorization. A lot of people seem to think that they are the same, that they're not the same. One is really, when we look at authentication, it's something you know, and everyone understands this because whenever you log into an application, you generally have a password that goes with that. Today, we are starting to look at things like being able to identify yourself not just with a password, but with some other form of that, right? And we've seen that with things like biometric fingerprint reading that's now baked into your phone. So not only do you log into your phone with either your Apple credentials or your Android credentials, when you lock a screen, you can use your fingerprint, right, to open or unlock that. Otherwise, someone's got to put a PIN in. And then also, we start looking at devices. So if I log into my desktop, I might get a notification code to my phone to say who I am. And in the old days, we called that claims-based authentication. If it walks like a duck, or that we used to call it duck typing actually. If it walks like a duck, and it looks like a duck, and it talks like a duck, chances are it is a duck. So that's just another way of identifying you. Now, once you've authenticated, you are then authenticated to have access to an environment. But there's another level after that. So what resources are you authorized to consume once you've been authenticated? And that's important to understand what that's. So look at your access level, what sort of data do you have access to, and also what are the apps and resources you have access to. And why is password management a thing of the past? I mean, Microsoft wants you to get to a passwordless environment, and I've got a roadmap in that on what you need to do in order to get to that. But why is passwords a thing? And I think Michael Knoll was doing a session earlier this week talking about, but chances are when we start looking at passwords, we will call it April 2020 and then May 2020 because we're asked to change our passwords all the time. And forget the brute force attacks that would normally come when someone's trying to get into your account, because it's not so much about that. The thing is, you can spoof portals. I had a customer the other day who got an email from her school, and it was an HTML file. She clicked on it. All they did was spoof the portal.office.com login page, and she provided them with their credentials, and boom, they were in. And once they get in, they can do pretty much anything, right? I mean, if they can get into your local workstation with that, they can put a keylogger in there, and then they'll get everything, all of the things from you. So be wary when you start doing that. And that's why multi-factor authentication is so important. So what is supported currently when it comes to multi-factor authentication inside of Teams? Because you remember, Teams looks at the identity and access management platform of Azure, I am inside of Azure, for authentication into Teams. So it's not just what sits in the M365 Admin Center. So cloud identity, that's if you are born completely in the cloud. Synchronized identity, if you are actually synchronizing your identity from an on-prem environment to the cloud, and then also a federated identity if you are using stuff like ADFS. That is all supported currently inside of your Office 365 tenant, which means that it's also supported by Office 360 by Microsoft Teams. And something as simple as being able to receive a text message or a code to say, put this code in, and boom, you are now providing an extra layer or a second level of authentication, two-factor or multi-factor authentication. And there are a myriad of ways of actually doing this. You can use the Authenticator app, which a lot of people that have lived in the Google world has been starting to use. And then also Microsoft's got their own Authenticator app. And naturally, when we look at the roadmap for moving to a passwordless environment, the first thing would be enable MFA, start looking at moving your SaaS apps to the cloud, and so forth, and Teams being one of those things. So you can really get to a point where you exist in the right type of passwordless world, and that applies to Teams. So start with MFA. It's the easiest way to fix your problems. Next up, conditional access, very important. It's one thing having MFA, but MFA is much bigger than just, well, I prefer to think of MFA as much bigger than just a traditional way of providing that second layer of authentication. Now, conditional access really applies to your entire Office 365 tenant, and that can be extended to users accessing Teams, because Teams is just another wrapper for a bunch of applications that you have access to. So the way conditional access policies work is you basically risk profile the user, and based on the risk, you're either allowing them in or you're not allowing them in. And when we look at how all of that works together with not only products like Teams, because Teams will consume the conditional access policy that's been defined by your organization, you can also look at other things. So let's unpack what it actually does. So one, when we configure Azure AD conditional access, or the policy, we build out a policy. And what's nice about your cloud tenant, something like if you've got an Office 365 or an M365 tenant, it's naturally, and a lot of customers don't understand this, when you create an Office 365 tenant, there's the Azure part to it automatically there. And there's a host of services that comes with Azure that your M365 tenant actually consumes, and conditional access is one of them. Now, you can set a bunch of conditions. This is what I wanted to talk about. There's a baseline security policy or baseline security enablement that sits inside of Azure that you can switch on, and that will switch on conditional access. It will also switch on multifactor authentication, and it will also switch on modern auth. And those are the things that we really want to make sure are switched on as a baseline before you go creating your own policies for conditional access. So what conditional access does, it looks at the user type, the device type. It also looks at where you are in the world and what type of application you're using to get into the system. And once it's done that, there's some computational analysis that goes on in the background around policies and real-time evaluations, and it profiles your risk as a user wanting to log in. Here's a perfect example. That same user that had a problem that was compromised from a login perspective, where they actually got their credentials, I managed to pick up that it was flagged as high risk because she lives in South Africa and she was logging in from Atlanta. Strange place to be logging in from. And she was flagged as high risk, and I got a notification saying, hey, this user's been flagged as high risk. So that's really about the risk profiling, and you can define what risks you are going to allow. So you might not be managing devices, and you'll allow that. So you'll allow the person to log in from any device, but you might want to say, well, I now want to apply a limited access based on an unmanaged device. So what you can then do there is, one, if it's an unmanaged device, I'm going to require and enforce MFA, because naturally, if I've got users coming into a building and I know that this is my IP address that I use to log into my tenant, and I've got 30 people in the building, I'm not going to enable MFA. And I'm going to apply that rule and say, well, if you are on these trusted IP ranges, you don't require MFA, because chances of attacker sitting in my building, logging in from my network, is highly unlikely, because they're not going to be there. They're probably sitting at a coffee shop somewhere around the world, usually in the Ukraine. And I say that with tongue in cheek, because this is not necessarily the right place, but I always use the same example. If you're sitting in a coffee shop in the Ukraine, are you going to allow that user into, even if it's a managed device? So you can limit by location as well to say, well, hey guys, you are coming from an untrusted location, enable MFA, and then also block legacy authentication. So think IMAP, POP, and SMTP. You can stop that sort of protocols from being used from a legacy perspective. So you don't allow that to be accessed. And you can also extend that to on-premises stuff as well. If you might have an application that you are now surfacing inside of Teams, but it doesn't live inside of Teams, you can also block authentication of that if it's not using modern auth. So there's quite a few things that you can do just from conditional access policies to improve the way people inside of your organization access content inside of Teams. And it's very important to understand it, because you can block the entire team or you can block things inside of Teams. When we start looking at what the the policies look like inside of Azure, it's actually quite rudimentary. You can actually head over to conditional access inside of your Azure portal. For those who have never looked at it, just go to portal.azure.com and it will actually allow you to log in. If you've got the credentials, you've got the rights to log into that, and go have a look at what the baseline security policies are already baked out right there. Just a top thing to consider when you are enabling modern authentication for your tenant. So you're only allowing modern auth into your tenant. And there is if you go into your M365 Admin Center and you go have a look at the settings tab on the left, org-wide settings, there's a tab there for modern authentication. And you have to tick that box, otherwise modern auth is you have to enable modern auth for Exchange. Otherwise, you can still connect to Exchange via SMTP, IMAP, or POP3. And a lot of attackers get in that way. So if you don't enable modern auth for Exchange, you've got other protocols that you can actually get into. So be very wary. And have a look at what's available to you. And what's nice about it is there's also some rich reporting on what conditional access looks like. So what's the device state of your environment, what sort of platforms, how many client apps, and you can actually have a look at who's coming in from where and start building out your risk profile, either improving it or pushing up the level or pushing down the level. Pretty much the same way as we do levels of lockdown. It's the same principle. And that's it really for conditional access policies. It is a thing. I would start with MFA and then look at the baseline conditional access policies available to you. I'd start there before you start looking at anything else. I mean, the big thing, and we'll talk about it now through external access, and I'm jumping ahead, so I'm not going to do that. Well, let's talk about external access, because one, you've now provided a level of security around who gets to access your environment with multi-factor authentication. So you're protecting your users from being hacked. Then you start looking at risk profiling those users that are now logging into your tenant. And just on the conditional access part of things, you can actually extend that to Azure B2B and B2C. So you can enforce MFA for someone that doesn't have an Office 365 account inside of your tenant. Just go look at the license implications of doing that. Now, once you've vetted the user coming in and you've also made sure that the user is in fact the user and not some hacker from a foreign country, you now need to decide who you are going to let in after you've allowed them to authenticate into your environment. And that's really where external access comes in. And the crazy part about external access, the slide is on by default. And if you look at the slide right now, you'll notice that there's only two things, right? So external access doesn't mean guest access. There's a fair difference between the two. And when we actually go look at what is supported when it comes to external access and how do you allow guest users into your environment, one is open federation, that's default. So there's no restrictions whatsoever into your environment. Boom, and that's what you generally have right now. So you can invite a guest to a meeting and you can add a guest to your environment. You can also specify the domains that you're allowing in, and I like this approach because then you can say, well, only these domains, these are my customers, and those are the people that I want to allow in. You can also block specific domains and understand what happens when you do either or. Once you set up a list of blocked domains, all of the other domains are allowed, and once you allow specific domains, all of the other domains are blocked. So pick your ruling correctly so that you don't have people coming back to you complaining about this, right? And when we look at guest access, it's not only allowing people in, but what do you allow them to do? I'll give you a perfect example. I was on a call with a bank, and we were talking about modernizing their environment. And in that call, they were not allowed to share a document with me. But on the other side, the guy said, well, I'll just mail it to you. Something to consider, right? Because that doesn't only apply to what happens inside of Teams, but also it's a much larger conversation when it comes to, and a lot of times people go, well, shit, man, we're not allowing external access into Teams. I say, well, but can they attach the document in an email and mail the person? Yeah, no, that's what we allow. I'm like, but then why won't you allow external access into Teams? Because it defeats the purpose. The same, right? At least in Teams, you can manage it better than allowing people to send a document about a new wonder drug to stop male pattern baldness from Pfizer, right? Because if you can attach the document, that means that it goes out and it will go to a Gmail account. Also understand what the difference is between external and versus guest access. So external access gives access permissions to the entire domain. Guest access gives a permission to a specific individual. And also, there's a lot of licensing conversations around how many guests can you have inside of a tenant. And generally, the rule of thumb is usually 5 guests per licensed user inside. I mean, there's no hard lock that you can only invite 5 people, but there are some premium features that will start switching on things for Microsoft if you're large enough for Microsoft to care. Now, there's a few dependencies when you start looking at Teams. Remember earlier on today, I talked about Teams being a wrapper for a bunch of services, and we've seen Matt Wade's periodic table that gives you an idea. So Teams sits on top of a few products. Teams sits on top of Exchange for chat, or that one-on-one chat, the messaging service side of things. It sits on top of SharePoint for storage, and it sits on top of OneDrive for individual storage. So if I share a document with someone else, even a guest, I need a OneDrive license in order to do that, or I need access to my own personal OneDrive. If I'm sharing documents inside of a team externally, that means that I have to switch on external access for products like SharePoint and OneDrive, because even though I can go, well, here's a link to my document that I'm sharing with you, if it's not enabled in the OneDrive's admin center, or the SharePoint admin center, in this case, that's actually the OneDrive admin center that you're looking at right now. It's not the SharePoint admin center. It's funny how OneDrive connects directly to SharePoint, and the only reason why they have 2 different names, because Microsoft screwed that up as usual. But just because you're allowing guest access inside of Teams doesn't mean that they're going to have access to content inside of Teams, because content is either stored in your OneDrive when it's a one-on-one, or it's stored inside of SharePoint under the Files tab, which is sitting inside of a channel, and the channel's got a document library on the back of that. So you need to enable file sharing or content sharing inside of SharePoint and OneDrive. Yeah. Next up, I want to talk about Teams policies. It's not that great. There's a few things. There's 4 different types of policies. There's Teams and channel policies. So what people can do? Can they delete messages and so forth, so on? Messaging policies. I'm sure you've all been into a tenant where you post a message and you can't edit it. Those are the things that you need to take into consideration. Who can do what? And from a retention perspective, you might want to look at that. Think about litigation hold, right? You are saying that there was hate speech in a chat, and someone can go in and delete that. So you want to have a look at what sort of policies you can apply to messaging inside of Teams, as well as Teams and channel policies. Who can do what? Can you upload a GIF? Giphy, can you add that? And those sort of things. Meeting policies, what gets recorded, what doesn't get recorded inside of a meeting, who can do what inside of meetings. It's important to understand what you can do from a group level and how you can mitigate the risk. And then last but not least, app permission policies. So can someone go to the App Store inside of Teams and add Asana or Rike or Trello as an application? So what applications are allowed? What applications are not allowed? Are you going to allow third-party apps? Are you publishing your own apps? Who's got access to those apps? So those people that lived in the SharePoint world, it's like the app catalog. It's pretty much the same thing. That's the world we come from, and we understand that, and that applies. Same principle applies here when you start looking at app permission policy. So who's got access to what? And can a simple user add an application? Yeah? So understand how that impacts what you're doing from a security perspective. Are you going to allow external apps in? You can literally switch on Dropbox, and people will be able to add their Dropbox to Teams. You don't manage that Dropbox. You don't know what sort of content is actually being added to Dropbox. Someone can drag content from OneDrive to Dropbox, boom, ninja dust. There's your file gone, right? Your file's been compromised. Your security, your confidentiality has been compromised. So it is important to make sure that you work through these policies, because they get governed at an org-wide level. Yeah? All right. I think the last thing I want to talk about is content protection. Now, we can extend Microsoft's protection policy. So if you look at Microsoft Information Protection, what is available to you, and I've got another slide deck that talks to that, but we pretty much consume the protection solutions inside of your entire tenant, not just for Teams, but it gets used inside of Teams. So when we look at what's available to you from a content store perspective, and you need to understand where content is stored. And I spoke a little bit about it earlier on. So your chat service actually sits inside of the Office 365 substrate, which, and I remember Christian Buckley calling it that. And when he says it, it sounds much better than what it does when I say it. Anyhow, your chat sits inside of Exchange, and content, the physical file, sits inside of SharePoint and OneDrive. So understand what you are able to do when it comes to information protection around that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that now. One, how do you secure information? There's two ways of doing it. There's sensitive labels. So think about sensitive content and what you can do around protection, and then also retention. So it's sensitivity and retention. Retention is how long do I have to keep a document for before I'm legally allowed to delete it. And sensitivity is around if I'm storing credit card information or personally identifiable information or any information about an EU citizen inside of a document, and I put that document somewhere, I need to label it, because that's confidential information and I don't want it to be shared externally. So understand how the difference between sensitivity labeling, what the difference is between sensitivity labels as well as retention labels. And it's important to understand what the difference is there. So when I look at what it is available to you, and the nice thing about sensitivity labels and retention labels is that you can go and create a data loss prevention policy and consume it based on the rules that you enforce from a sensitivity labeling perspective or a retention labeling perspective, because they both do different things. One protects and one retains. You could say, well, for this document, even though you delete it, I know that because it's got this label, I need to keep it for 5 years, even though the user's deleted it. And those are things that you can extend both sensitivity as well as retention to Teams. So the same principles apply to the object or the container of the object. So you can say because Teams sits on top of Microsoft 365 groups, it's no longer called Office 365 groups, you can actually apply that level of, well, I want to make sure that this team they can't share documents. So even though I've got external sharing and guest access enabled, no, they can't. Boom. Apply a label to that. And it's the same with retention. I want to retain this team for 3 years, even though there's nothing happening inside the team. Now, when you start looking at where these things are, you don't only have to make sure that it's sitting on top of SharePoint and OneDrive, extended to Office 365 or M365 groups. You can also make sure that if you are mailing stuff into Teams or mailing stuff, well, you can't mail stuff out of Teams, it applies to things like Exchange. So it's not just limited to what you're doing at Teams. And understand that information protection or sensitivity labels, which is crazy, actually exists both in the security center and the compliance center, which was, since they've split the two, it's an interesting thing. Now, just a few things on this. I think it's important that you understand the difference, and you've got to find that balance between what you're doing at a security level and also how do you make sure that it doesn't stifle productivity in your organization. You can't just ban external access. They'll find another way to provide access to this document, like, hey, I've got Dropbox, let me put the document there and I'll share it with you. So consider what you need to do. Find a happy medium between the two, right? Because there's stuff that you can do inside a DLP. There's stuff that you can do from a conditional access perspective to block access to sensitive data and so forth, so on, but make sure that it doesn't stifle the productivity. Now, let's go through a list of what's available to you inside of Microsoft Teams. Advanced threat protection, we all know what that is. Safe links, safe attachments, communication compliance, and I've got to finish up because we've got to keep this under 30 minutes. Obviously, data loss prevention, we've spoken about. Retention policies to keep things from a litigation perspective, how long you should keep it. And then also you've got great e-discovery, you've got great litigation hold when it comes to and investigating things. You've got amazing auditing and reporting, and you can actually do quite a cool compliant content search when you need to make sure that the content that you are creating is compliant. However, understand what that means and everything I've just spoken to you about right now when it applies to private channels, because private channels functions considerably different to standard teams with standard channels. From our 5 tips, 5 steps, everything's about fives, the power of fives. Make sure that you understand in closing what you want to do. MFA, first thing, it fixes probably 99% of the problems that you might have. Understand what legacy authentication means. It's another big risk. Switch on modern auth with that security baseline that you get inside of Azure. Understand risk profiling inside of conditional access. So you can mitigate the risk by profiling where the user's logging in from, what they're doing, and where they're doing it from. And then last thing for me when it comes to Teams, understand that Teams is a wrapper of services. You need to make sure that you've got access to SharePoint and OneDrive if you want to share files. Chat is available to you, so that's not a problem, but you can apply retention and sensitivity policies to the entire team. So if it's a highly confidential environment that you're working in and you're collaborating with an external party, you can lock that down from a sensitivity perspective by using what's available to you in the Security and Compliance Center. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can find me online at Alistar Pugin. And if you want to read up a bit more about what I do, go have a look at Regarding 365. That's where I generate most of my content, specifically on YouTube as well. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.